Introduction. Through Bhakti Tirtha Swami's great efforts, his spiritual legacy will live on and endure throughout posterity. Alice Coltrane. Bhakti Tirtha Swami, 1950 to 2005, the urban mystic at the center of this book, was a person of singular determination, a courageous and bold teacher of spiritual science. His work took him around the world, particularly to Eastern Europe behind the Iron Curtain, where he surpassed all others in sharing divine wisdom, often risking his own life, and to Africa, where kings and queens acknowledged him as High Chief and recognized him as a spiritual leader. He was esteemed in the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, ISKCON, as well. Here he was a respected sannyasi, a monk in the renounced order of life, and a guru with disciples of his own. He was the world's first African American Vaishnav spiritual master, and he published many books too, explaining how to apply the eternal principles of God consciousness in the modern world. His books use the language of conflict resolution and depth psychology, as well as that of the New Age. They foster spiritual advancement through principle-centered leadership techniques and inner realizations. In addition, he had a tremendous ability to touch people on a deep level, to change lives, as thousands of friends and disciples can attest to. Setting the scene. How did he get here? Back in his youth, when he was known as John Favors or simply as Johnny Boy, he had always dreamed of going to Africa. He had roots there, but he could only trace his ancestry back a generation or two, when the family had already arrived in the United States, specifically in Alabama. Years later, as a student at Princeton in 1968, he had adopted the name Toshombe Abdul, identifying even more with his African heritage. By the time he graduated in 1972, his professors had arranged an expense-paid trip for him to Africa, along with a teaching position at an important institution of learning. But it was not to be. He didn't go where they wanted him to go. Instead, he joined the Hare Krishna movement. Shoot forward to the end of 1979. He had recently become a monk in the renounced order of life, sannyas, and started to think deeply about how to best use his African American identity to convey the truths of the spirit. That is to say, as a spiritually gifted black man, he perceived the importance of communicating with others of his race and to thereby share with them the treasure he had received from the Hare Krishna movement. Thinking along these lines, he finally went to Africa. As the hot sun greeted him at Murtala Mohammed International Airport, Nigeria, there was a sense of coming home, even though he had never been here before, at least not in this life. Nonetheless, this was a triumphant return of sorts for impressions deeply embedded in his psyche, as well as ancestors whose genes permeated his body whispered of his connection with a land long forgotten. And though several generations of separation had dimmed the memory, he was now returning with a gift, something the people of Africa would embrace with full enthusiasm. He was bringing them Krishna consciousness. But for the moment, as he stepped off the plane, he was overcome with a barrage of emotions, seeing Africa's sea of faces set alight by her sweltering heat. As a black man from Ohio and a child of the 60s, he knew well about Pan-Africanism, which claims that diasporan black people throughout the world are forever linked with Africans through a common experience of oppression and slavery. But he was even more convinced of his real identity as a spirit soul. He knew that ultimate truth transcends bodily identification. Yet here he was in Africa, exposed to its people, its beauty, its exotica. How did he get here? He finds himself remembering childhood folk tales about the Congo and also colorful stories of Madagascar. He sees truth in a village in Nairobi and the heavens on a mountaintop palace of Kabare. Gradually, he will experience the problems and the miracles of life in Africa. After some time, spiritual and political leaders in Wari, Nigeria, will make him a high chief, a rare privilege for a Westerner reaching maturity in the ghettos of Cleveland. Again, how did he get here? This book seeks to answer that question, but not before acquainting the reader with the Krishna consciousness that the Swami was bringing to Africa. This was no sectarian religion. It was not the Hinduism that had long existed among the African people. Having arrived there in the 19th century along with hopeful immigrants, rather, this was the ancient tradition known as Sanatan Dharma or the eternal function of the soul, also called Vaishnavism. The worship of God in his most confidential feature as Vishnu or Krishna, as far as Bhakti Tirtha Swami was concerned, he was bringing to the people of Africa the subtle thread that ties together all religious truth. He was not interested in one religion as opposed to another. The sectarian battle that foists one aspect of spirituality to the forefront while belittling or even demonizing all others. He was interested in the science of God consciousness, the underlying reality at the core of all genuine religious revelations, and the process by which one can awaken one's love of God. Spiritual adherents of all religious traditions can apply the principles taught by this pristine Indic system with equal benefit. The Hare Krishna movement. The movement that brings us this precious fruit of India's ancient spiritual heritage was incorporated in New York City in 1966, though it sprouted from the seeds of a religious and cultural system that is thousands of years old. These seeds were brought west by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada 1896 to 1977. Bhakti Tirtha Swami, spiritual master. Prabhupada founded a movement called the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, which has theological roots that can be understood in terms of two historical paradigms, one modern and the other ancient. The modern form of the movement reaches back into the 16th century Bengal when Chaitanya Mahaprabhu 1486 to 1533, the revered religious ecstatic who fully embodied the movement's teachings, practices, and goals, vibrated a song of universal love. This song's main chorus centered on the chanting of the holy names of God, especially the Mahamantra or the great chant for deliverance. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. What does the mantra mean? Again, the implications of this uniquely transcendent prayer are not sectarian but universal. The word Hare is the vocative form of Mother Hara, another name for Radha, Krishna's eternal consort and the very embodiment of devotional service, bhakti. Essentially, this refers to God and the potency by which one can serve Him, regardless of one's chosen religious tradition. Rama is another name for Krishna, meaning he who gives his devotees the highest pleasure. Thus, in brief translation, the chant may be rendered as follows: O Lord, O energy of the Lord, Radha, please engage me in your divine service. While Chaitanya favored this most selfless prayer, he taught that the recitation of any of God's names would have similar effect. The thing that Bhakti Tirtha Swami liked most about chanting is that it puts one in direct touch with the Supreme. It pierces through all physical, mental, and intellectual layers of existence, situating one on the spiritual platform. This is because God's name is absolute. It is one with His essence, a fact that is realized when one's chanting is perfected. This ultimate oneness between God and His name, of course, is distinctly spiritual, and it also reveals a fundamental difference between matter and spirit. Material substances are relative, that is, in the material world, a thing and its name are not one and the same. They are two individual items. On the other hand, in the spiritual world, which is the exact opposite of the material world, the reverse must be true. An essential oneness engulfs all. This is not to say that there is no hierarchy in the spiritual world, with various gradations perceivable by spiritual adepts, but rather a sense of oneness and difference exists simultaneously. Through chanting, an accomplished practitioner develops an awareness of God's absolute and spiritual nature. That is, there is no difference between the Nami, the named one, and the Nama, the name. Absorption in the otherworldly nature of Krishna and his name is the heart of Vaishnav mysticism, leading to the love of God. But it is not a random or haphazard exercise. Rather, it is a detailed exercise with many rules, regulations, and ancillary practices that serve to facilitate perfect chanting. By absorbing oneself in the holy name, one becomes spiritualized, totally engulfed in God's energy. Because chanting the name of God is so much emphasized in Vaishnav texts, practitioners focus on chanting as a central devotional method. Thus, deep meditation and great emotion accompany one, japa, soft chanting on beads similar to the Christian rosary, 2, kirtan, loud chanting or singing, and 3, sankirtan, congregational chanting or distribution of the holy name. As we will see, Bhakti Tirtha Swami excelled in all three forms of this practice at various points in his devotional life. This practice of reciting mantras is rooted in earlier Vedic texts. The Vedic literature constitutes the scriptural legacy of ancient India, detailing the science of love of God, where glorification of God's names is recommended as the most effective form of self realization for the modern age. In fact, it was seen by spiritual adepts and the open secret of the Vedic tradition, the hidden jewel of the Indian scriptures. In the late 15th century, European kings sent their heroic explorers in search of new routes to treasure filled India. Many returned home on ships laden with silk, spices, artwork, and magnificent jewels. But they bypassed India's real treasure, which was just then being widely distributed by Lord Chaitanya. Prior to Chaitanya's time, a reawakening of Krishna Bhakti or devotion to Krishna had swept the subcontinent, drawing on centuries old Sanskrit texts and vernacular poetry composed by Chaitanya's immediate predecessors. Now, Chaitanya and his followers were filling in the missing pieces by showing how to put this deep theology into practice and by emphasizing the power of the holy name. In this way, Chaitanya pioneered a great social and spiritual movement that continues to spread its profound influence worldwide. At the very least, Chaitanya transformed India in four respects. Philosophically, by establishing the logic of personal absolute named Krishna and the need for rendering loving service to him. Socially, by opposing the blindly rigid caste system and a setting in place a universal doctrine that is open to all. Politically, by organizing India's first civil disobedience movement, predating both Gandhi and Martin Luther King by centuries, against a repressive government, and most important, spiritually, by teaching and demonstrating that love for Krishna is the secret meaning behind all the Vedic texts, the cooling balm to heal all the world's woes, and the ultimate non sectarian truth for which everyone is searching. Bhakti Tirtha Swami took hold of this truth and stretched it to its limits, particularly in relation to social reform and personal application. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's non denominational movement came to be called Gaudiya, Bengali, or Chaitanyite Vaishnavism, but as stated, it was deeply rooted in the much older tradition of Krishna Bhakti. To this end, it makes use of standard classical texts like Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, and the Srimad Bhagavatam, and in this sense, it is quite orthodox. It claims affiliation with the prestigious Brahma Madhva Sampradaya lineage and can trace its teaching to Brahma, the father of the created universe. This is the second historical paradigm by which ISKCON can be understood. In this context, it is called Sanatan Dharma or the eternal function of the soul. As mentioned above, to briefly clarify, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu did not begin his mission to teach something new. Rather, his purpose was to reveal deeper esoteric truths found at the core of ancient Vedic tradition, a tradition that transcends sectarian concerns. Again, his teaching embodies the original spiritual truth found in all religion. Thus, it is not merely Hindu dogma, but rather a transcendental science that benefits everyone, regardless of one's religious or sectarian affiliation. Even the chanting, as mentioned above, is not peculiar to Vaishnavism. It can be found as a general principle in all religions. This was something that Bhakti Tirtha Swami emphasized in his teaching. Muhammad counseled, "Glorify the name of your Lord, the Most High." Quran 87.2. Saint Paul said, "Everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved." Romans 10.13. Buddha declared, "All who sincerely call upon my name will come to me after death, and I will take them to paradise." Vows of Amida Buddha 18. King David preached, "From the rising of the sun to its setting, the name of the Lord is to be praised." Psalms 113.3. And the Vaishnav scriptures repeatedly assert, "Chant the holy name, chant the holy name, chant the holy name of the Lord. In this age of quarrel, there is no other way, no other way, no other way to attain spiritual enlightenment." Brihan Naradiya Puran 3.8.126. Prabhupada brought these teachings to the West, claiming that his only credit was that he did not change anything but delivered what he had received as it is. God's revealed word, Prabhupada told his followers, is the absolute truth. For our part, he said, we can only follow this truth and convey it to others without interpolation or change. Moreover, unlike other gurus and god men from India, Prabhupada was adamant that a human being should not be identified with God. He claimed that he was merely God's humble servant and that he was ready, willing, and able to teach others how to serve in the same capacity. Bhakti Tirtha Swami inherited this mission from Srila Prabhupada, as did others, and he brought it to various parts of the world, particularly to Africa. Of course, the Hare Krishna movement had already appeared in that continent by 1969. This was due to the diligent efforts of Shaktimati Devi Dasi and later in 1971 Brahmananda Swami before Bhakti Tirtha Swami arrived there. The work was carried on by Pushta Krishna Swami and others, all disciples of His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Indeed, Prabhupada himself had been to Nairobi several times and had journeyed to South Africa in 1975. But all of these endeavors had been confined to South and East Africa. West Africa had to patiently wait for Bhakti Tirtha Swami's arrival in late 1979. Once there, he was able to spread his master's mission in an unprecedented way, both because of the color of his skin and because of his unique characteristics, from personal charisma to purity of purpose. A black lotus emerges. The book's title deserves brief explanation. A lotus is a specific kind of lily, but it is also an ancient and universal symbol of spirituality and can be found in the writings of the Aryan Hindus, the Buddhists, and the Egyptians as well. It was adopted as a Christian emblem by Greek and Latin churches, who eventually replaced it with the water lily. In India, where it perhaps most well known as a sacred symbol, is viewed in a philosophical way that it is particularly pertinent in our present context and thus worthy of scrutiny. The roots of a lotus, say ancient Indic texts, are found in mud, while its stem grows up through the surrounding water and its beautifully scented flower lies above its liquid source, basking in the bright sunlight. In a similar way, a true spiritual practitioner, while taking birth in the mud like quicksand of the material world, rises up above its dirty waters, untouched by its considerable contaminants. This lotus like phenomenon is poignantly demonstrated in the life of Bhakti Tirtha Swami, who, though born in the ghettos of Cleveland, rose to prominence as a true spiritual leader, as we shall soon see. Though there are other water plants that bloom above the water, it is only the lotus that, because of the strength of its stem, commonly rises 8 to 12 inches above the surface. Similarly, though others have risen to great heights on the spiritual path, Bhakti Tirtha Swami's contribution was truly unique, given his strength of character and the kind of person he was. Thus, while there are white, red, blue, pink, and even golden lotuses, there is only one black lotus, and that's what this book attempts to bring to light. Bhakti Tirtha Swami's urban roots made him especially sensitive to the needs of the downtrodden, and so he championed not only the cause of equal rights for blacks but also for disenfranchised women, homosexuals, children, and for all marginalized factions of society. This he particularly fought for in the Hare Krishna movement, but he did so in general as well. His compassion and far reaching spiritual vision has left a significant mark on the movement of which he was a part and on the outside world too. Exactly how this is so will be revealed in the following pages. It is interesting that the names by which he was known in the Hare Krishna movement tell us much about who he actually was. For example, Srila Prabhupada gave him the name Ganesham Das, which means servant of the blackish cloud. The name Ganesham refers to Krishna, God, who in his original form is as beautiful as a dark rain cloud with a complexion to match. Prabhupada had thus acknowledged his disciple's beauty as a charismatic black man, an African American with marked exquisiteness both materially and spiritually. But more, in giving him this name, he predicted that his then fledgling disciple would eventually take Sham, another name for Krishna, to Ghana, or that part of Africa, among others, where Bhakti Tirtha Swami did indeed ultimately spread Krishna consciousness. Also, Bhakti Tirtha, the name he was given at his sannyas ceremony when he became a lifelong monk, was highly appropriate as well. This is so because he was like a true tirtha or holy place, in that such places are like bridges to the spiritual world. The word tirtha is conceptually linked to the Sanskrit tirthankara or bridge builder. The idea being that a spiritual teacher too is like a bridge to the spiritual realm, for they give people facility to get there. He especially was like a bridge using bhakti or devotion to bring people to Krishna, hence Bhakti Tirtha. Along related lines, his style of conveying Krishna consciousness emphasized the importance of bridge building so that outsiders would have easy access to the philosophy. Accordingly, he drew on varied sources and revolutionary methods to express traditional truths. These were his bridges to get people to the other side. His intense desire to do this, was a product of his compassion, which inspired him ever fresh methods of bringing sincere souls to the lotus feet of Krishna. For a brief period in ISKCON's history, in fact, he was known as Srila Krishnapad, which again indicates his favored position at Lord Krishna's lotus feet and his ever broadening capacity to give shelter to others. Of course, he was also a Swami, which indicates one who is able to control his senses. As we shall see in his life as a devotee reveals these qualities in abundance. But there is more. Krishnapad was a recurring theme in Bhakti Tirtha Swami's life. Sometimes he knew it and sometimes he did not. Let me explain. We have already indicated the more common usage of the term Krishnapad, wherein it is viewed as one who has taken shelter at Lord Krishna's lotus feet. However, the word has another meaning as we discover later in this book. Krishnapad can also mean black foot. And in this sense, yet again, the word is graphically linked to Bhakti Tirtha Swami. He was born with a black birthmark on his left foot, a distinguished bodily characteristic remembered by close family members and friends. More, it would be a tumor under this very birthmark that would eventually take his life. So Krishnapad has been with Krishnapad throughout. Bhakti Tirtha Swami's story, of course, goes far beyond thought provoking coincidences or even divine truths regarding his name or title. It is a story of victory over obstacles, of a pious childhood that was punctuated by poverty and racial discrimination. It is the story of a true spiritual seeker who achieved an extraordinary level of accomplishment and then enthusiastically shared his gain with all who would have it. This same treasure will also be shared with anyone who enters into the mood and message of this book. One last point. Some readers might question the propriety or even the need of telling Bhakti Tirtha Swami's life story, and they may wonder why he would encourage such an enterprise, as he does in the foreword. After all, a Vaishnav is characterized by his humility, and a humble person would naturally be disinclined to have others focus on the details of his or her life. And this is certainly true. Indeed, there is a saying that for the Vaishnav, self-praise is as good as death. Still, there is a caveat, an exception, when the writing of one's own biography or the willingness to allow another to do so would not only be approved but enthusiastically endorsed. This exception manifests when the story has a purpose larger than itself, when one's life might convey the truths of Krishna consciousness. The medieval Vaishnav text Brihad Bhagavatamrita 2.1.107 to 109, written by the sage Sanatana Goswami, makes this clear when it describes the value of autobiographical narrative, saying that at times there is no literary device as effective in explaining spiritual reality. This was also seen in the final pastimes of Srila Prabhupada, Bhakti Tirtha Swami's own spiritual master. When in 1977 Srila Prabhupada was preparing to leave his mortal frame, his then secretary Tamal Krishna Goswami expressed his belief that the world could be further enlightened by Prabhupada's life story. His divine master agreed, explicitly stating who his biographer should be, Satsvarup Das Goswami, and enumerating various childhood stories that might be included in the text. So, Prabhupada's own example shows that a Vaishnav could endorse his own biography, at least if the story might serve the greater good of humankind. Bhakti Tirtha Swami similarly saw his life in terms of what it could do for his fellow human beings, how it could be used to enlighten and instruct. In this spirit, he came to the conclusion that his story should be told and that I should be the one who tells it. Black Lotus thus attempts to convey a taste a drop of the Swami's journey and accomplishments, just to whet readers' appetites. To do so more would be impossible. The full story, due to its enormity, variety, and spiritual intensity, resists comprehensive treatment, and omission has been necessary for a number of reasons. This being the case, be prepared for mere glimpses of the Swami's life, although my historical lens and attention to detail might make it seem more complete. In other words, the Swami's tale unfolds with necessary gaps perceived between the light and shadow of the material world, with implications that will be understood only according to the realizations of individual readers. Additionally, this is not a book for scholars or historians. Rather, it serves as a template for those on a spiritual quest. It is not for those merely seeking knowledge, but for those who are also seeking love. Without further ado, then, let us pay close attention to the black lotus now blossoming on these pages.